Good evening. We meet today at a very complex moment, not only due to the Israeli war in Gaza that left one of the most catastrophic crises in the modern ages, but due to the deep questions raised about the role of journalism, its limitations, and ethical responsibility. Since the 7th of October, it became very clear that a big part of the international journalism does not stand at the same stance it should be standing at. So instead of detecting the impowers of balances, it reproduced them. And instead of holding those responsible, they just adopted the official rhetoric. Since the 7th of October, thousands of journalists around the world found themselves in an exception living. In the Western world, many people felt that the freedom of expression is being limited and that the Gaza war uh, has have held them responsible. Many of them are prosecuted or dismissed from their jobs, or many direct punishments are imposed on them, and many of them, because they're frustrated, decided to stop working for a specific period or totally. And this reality makes us raise one question: how can journalism play its role, which is seeking the truth in an environment with more pressures and with more murders falling off? Omar Akkad one day will become everyone against what happened, provides a critical reading for this moment. This book does not speak only about violence, but also about the language of violence hidden behind it and the different narratives that are being reproduced and the risks that would be surrounding anyone trying to seek that truth. Ms. Zahira Harb, today we want to understand the meaning of journalism, where journalism is threatened. What does journalism need today to regain the trust of people and to continue providing a very accurate record for the world? Allow us to welcome Omar Akkad, a journalist winning different prizes, very well known for his for American war story and Paradise, and one day everyone will have been against this. Allow me to welcome Omar Zahira Harb too, who is the head of the board of directors of ARIJ and the head of the high studies in Series London University. Welcome, Zahira. Start with you, Omar. You say that the world will reproduce the history. One day, everyone will become against what happened today. Why and how the narration becomes a tool for politics.
Thank you very much for doing this, first of all. I apologize that my Arabic is just good enough that I can sort of understand the question, but not answer it in Arabic, which is a very weird space to be in. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with both of you. Where I live in the US, and this is true in Canada as well, if you come to an event like this, or if you go to a literary event, almost of any kind, it usually begins with something called a land acknowledgement. And what a land acknowledgement is that at the very beginning of the event, somebody will come up to the podium and they will say that, before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we are here on the unceded indigenous territory of whatever native tribe used to occupy this land before the settlers came along. This has now become the norm for virtually every literary event, a land acknowledgement. The reason we have these land acknowledgements is because a very long group of settlers came along and they committed an act of genocide to take over this land. And now, hundreds of years later, we are acknowledging it. I think in every instance of colonialism, there is a very well-crafted narrative device to acknowledge the horror, to acknowledge the terrible thing, long after the terrible thing has been done. And so the reason my book is called what it's called is because I have very little doubt that we are witnessing right now a decades-long act of colonial theft, which we have to watch play out in real time, knowing that many, many decades later, once the theft is gone, there is going to be a narrative device by which everybody can feel sorry about this after the fact. And to me, this is one of the most frustrating aspects of this, is knowing full well that there's going to be great acts of apology, and that the only thing that is certain about every one of those acts is that it's going to arrive far too late to be of any real value.
ظاهرة حرب. Omar Akkad mentioned a phenomenon, and maybe he is warning us because it's a very well-known phenomenon. What do we call it? Is it normalization, propaganda, or something deeper than that? First of all, allow me to start where he stopped, because I was in Australia in a conference last year, and this recognition by those who are living now on the land made us question ourselves and say, one day Palestine, this will take place in it. And then we've decided that no, we will not wait that long till the moment where the colonial will be apologizing from the Palestinian because he took over his land and he's dealing with it now normally and apologizing, and that's it. After time really passes and it's too late to apologize. So let's try to explain what's going on now. And this is what we've seen in Umar's book. Thank you very much, Umar, for the book. We shouldn't wait until where it's too late. One extra thing, what we've lived and what we're living, especially in relation to journalism and media. And there is difference, by the way, between the act of journalism and the media and media institutions and outlets, because journalism is our profession, but media institutions today became political institutions. So there is a difference between a political decision of a media outlet, which is what we've seen during Gaza coverage, and the journalism as an action. As you said, many journalists, because we don't want to be unfair to them, many of them in the West stood up and said, we do not agree, we do not accept. All of us know that they became victims of what's being called institutional anxiety. The anxiety of the institutions, because institutions lived too in fear of what will happen to them if they are ethically have courage to cover the work soundly and to cover their profession correctly. So part of what took place is related to the apologies, the mass apologies, because it's related to the mass memory of people. Journalism, the way we know it, is the first line of writing the history. It's the memory, mass memory, collective memory of people, and then the historicals will read the journalists' pieces to write history. So when the coverage is very scattered and has no factual reality and it does not cover what's really happening, the history will give us only some information that are superficial. Omar Akkad, to what extent some of the writers today and journalists face this and resist it?
I mean, it's a really fascinating question because in a perfect world, there would be no obligation. What I mean by this is that, you know, where I live in the US and where I spend most of my time, which is in North America, there is a very, very strong attachment to this idea that the journalist has to be objective and neutral and a sort of neutral party in whatever they're covering. And that's great. That's fantastic if you're looking at a level playing field and if everybody involved is operating in good faith. If nobody is lying, if nobody is being deliberately disingenuous, that model works. But very rarely is the playing field level. And very rarely is everybody operating in good faith. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, in February, I was driving home and I was listening to NPR, which is the public broadcaster in the US. And there was an interview with a woman who studies public health care in the United States. There's very little public health care in the United States. And what there is, the government right now is trying to destroy. And so one of the politicians had said something that like 50% of all expenses in public healthcare are fraudulent, which is a complete fantasy. It has no relationship to reality. And the journalist was asking this woman about this, and the woman said, look, we have no proof that any of this is true. When we do our research, we find that maybe 5% is errors, mathematical errors. And then the journalist who was interviewing her said something that was really interesting to me. She said, well, you say 5%. This man says 50%. Is there not a middle ground there? And I thought, like, this is objective neutral journalism, right? This person says the moon is made of cheese. This person says the moon is not made of cheese. Maybe the moon is half made of cheese. And in a level playing field, when people are behaving in good faith, there is no obligation for the journalist to resist anything. Journalism becomes a much easier endeavor. Unfortunately, we don't live in that world. And once you recognize that we don't live in that world, to try and pretend that you can be an objective, neutral party is abdicating the responsibility of journalism, because you are now benefiting the party that is operating in bad faith. And so I think that the obligation to resist in a perfect world shouldn't exist for a journalist. But the world we live in, any act of honest journalism is an act of resistance. Because at some point you have to say, this person says the moon is made of cheese, and also they are lying. And that's the part that a lot of reporters, certainly where I live, have trouble with. Because usually the person telling you the moon is made of cheese has a lot of power, and they can exert that power on you. So that's what I think of when I think of resistance. In an ideal world, you don't have to do it, but we don't live in an ideal world.
Zahira Harb, if we speak about media and journalists, institutions, would you feel that there are many institutions or the media itself in general? Does it prefer to stay in rest instead of giving the truth because the truth needs more boldness? Yes, like it means encouragement. Yes, as I said before, I talked about the institutional anxiety, which is practically related to the different media institutions and outlets who fear to be very clear. And I'm not speaking about clarity. What we need to do is just to cover the reality as it is. And at a moment, at a human tragedy moment, she translated it into Arabic like genocide and wars against humanity. We need to be ethically couraged and say, I can't put in one scale the victim and the perpetrator. Objectivity and neutrality is one of the areas that are very important. And we're working in the impartiality. When you talk about this balance of powers, we cannot create this balance, the balance of giving misinformation and correct information. The BBC, when it covers the climate, it reached a convention where they discovered that there is something called false balance. So, practically speaking, why would you think that there's something called false balance in covering the climate while there is nothing called false balance in covering genocide? Speaking about impartiality, allow me to speak about the objectivity and the neutrality and what neutrality in Arabic is. Neutrality, absolute neutrality. It's more than that, even beyond. Why? You're not neutral when it's related to discrimination. Why you're neutral when it's related to genocide? Those questions should be raised by us as journalists. We should ask ourselves these questions, or otherwise we will be upholding to the ideas because they make us fine and we don't confront the reality, but we need to. Omar, this takes us to the language sensitivity, and you've written about it in your book, the new book. You said that the emperor is immune within its own castle of language. What castle of language protects us today?
So there's a story that I write about in the book. In 2008, I went to cover the military trials in Guantanamo Bay. And Guantanamo Bay is a very strange place. It's a place that, a year earlier, I had gone to Afghanistan to cover the NATO invasion. And that's where I saw the physical violence of wartime. I saw what the bombs do. I saw what the bullets do. In Guantanamo, I saw every kind of other violence. There was no physical violence that we saw because it was kept to the side, but we saw linguistic violence. We saw the violence of language. We saw the violence of censorship. We saw the violence of euphemism, where you refuse to call something what it is. And so there's this story that I go back to quite a bit. We were touring the prison camps, and the soldier giving us the tour, I was asking him a question. And I said, so when do the prisoners, and as soon as I got to that word prisoners, he stopped me and he said, we don't have prisoners here, sir. We have detainees. And it was very, very important that they have detainees, not prisoners, because a prisoner implies a prison sentence. A judge has to give that sentence. A detainee you can just hold forever. And you see this all around the world, including in Palestine, right? We have administrative detention. Language is one of the most useful means of taking something horrific and making it palatable, making it acceptable, making it seem less horrific than it actually is. And so we have so many examples of this. When some soldier operating a joystick on the other side of the planet accidentally bombs a wedding party, they haven't killed those people. What we have is collateral damage. When the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay went on hunger strike to protest their conditions, they weren't going on hunger strike. The US military called it asymmetric warfare. Because what are the soldiers going to do? Also go on hunger strike back? No, it's asymmetric warfare. This stuff is really, really important, because otherwise you have to face what a thing is, and it makes it much, much harder to look away from it or to accept it. Sorry, go ahead.
لماذا تفشل اللغة سريعا؟
Why the language fails when the victims are Arabs or Muslims or Black people, for instance.
It comes back to what you were saying earlier about this notion of why are you able to behave in the way that we know you're able to behave when the subject is racism, or when the subject is something that has passed a certain threshold where, okay, it's now acceptable to call this what it is. Part of this is just plain racism. It's plainly racism. Very little of the discourse, at least where I live, around any issue related to Palestinians makes any sense unless you accept that Palestinians are subhuman. That is the only way that any facet of Western discourse around any issue related to Palestine makes any sense at all. And you see this manifest over and over and over again in every way. I remember watching a British, and I think I wrote about this in the book, there was a British newscaster who was writing about a 4-year-old girl who had been shot to death by Israeli soldiers at a checkpoint. Except he didn't say that. He said, a bullet found its way into the van and collided with a 4-year-old young lady. What the hell is a 4-year-old young lady? I defy anyone in this room to explain to me what a 4-year-old young lady is. Again, it's an immense use of power. And one of the most infuriating aspects is that you see it apply to a certain group of human beings, and you know full well that if it was ever applied to another group of human beings that are considered sufficiently human, that guy would get fired tomorrow.
زاهرة حرب كيف تشارك غرف الأخبار؟
Zahira Harb, how newsrooms are participating in what Omar Akkad called the misinformation or language violence. Allow me to comment on what Omar said, because there are two striking points I used to write about them short time ago. Something related to racism. And yes, what we see in the coverage of Gaza in specific and in the Sudanese coverage is related not only to the news values, but here we're speaking about geographic proximity, which is one of the values. It's the proximity of geographies of the story itself, the news story. In Gaza topic, it's not about geographic proximity, but the political proximity and the racism. or racial proximity and political proximity. They identified the narrative in Gaza, and both concepts were prevalent in newsrooms. I'm repeating, there's a difference between a journalist, because we have some journalists who participated in establishing the power of the neutral language, which is meaningless, which reduces the value of the event. But the main action was by the media institutions and outlets who practiced the political proximity and racial proximity action when they covered news. So the question now is, how would newsrooms participate or use this language mentioned by Omar Akkad? So, in producing the news, allow me to speak about many examples. We've done a research on specific words. They weren't allowed to be used by journalists in coverage. New York Times didn't allow them to use genocide or ethnic cleansing words in Gaza news coverage. Many other newsrooms didn't allow them to use the word genocide and even massacre. Massacre as a word wasn't allowed in many newsrooms. I'm speaking about Great Britain. I'm coming from there. In UK, there are some newsrooms that are primary that didn't allow the journalists to use the massacre word to comment on what's going on in Gaza. And this decision is not editorial decision. It's not a journalist decision. It's a political decision. And this political rhetoric banned them from using such words, but those words reflect the reality, nothing else. When I have an expert in human rights, and he's telling me that this equals a war crime, why I'm not allowed to use war crimes as a word or a phrase? Because if I use this phrase, there will be reaction to it after I use it. And this is what they want to reach in their coverage. So, can journalists, I'm not speaking about institutions now, you said journalists are something and institutions are something else, but can we break this lexicon, or is it difficult to break it? So, being said, are journalists able to break it? It's difficult to break this lexicon, but many journalists decided to be ethical and faced and confronted their institutions. Some of them in Australia prosecuted the institutions and they won against their own institutions. So I always tell my students in such times, human should decide whether to stand with his humanity or his job, or otherwise the profession of journalism would be turned into a performance-based job not related to the basics or the core of journalism. You should never hide the truth. Speaking about breaking such things, 3-4 international institutions decide every morning what the whole world should know today, what we should know. And we have many media experiences everywhere in the Arab world, in Europe, and in the United States, among other countries. However, they stay weak. They're not prevalent or not influential. So how can we today have a counter front to counter such news? I don't like to speak about counter fronts. No, in my opinion, I do believe in all of these dimensions, a journalist, even when I speak about his professionality, the question is what identifies professionalism in journalism. There are specific criteria, but the main concept for me is you should speak behind the truth, regardless if it harms your enemy or friend, socially and politically and religiously and culturally. We should seek the truth, and this is the only thing that should be our compass. We should never be guided by anything else. The day we start to hide the truth, the accident, to protect some people or institutions or political parties or countries, maybe, you will be distancing yourself from your profession, but ethically you're committed to work within its criteria. Omar Akkad, in your new book, you've spoken about shahada, martyrship, and it has a whole chapter in your book. In Gaza today, The Palestinians are documenting their death by themselves and the genocide by themselves. How did this change your perception to the authority of journalism?
It's a fascinating question because one of the things that has happened over the last 2 years is that I've had to completely change how I think about what I expect from journalism. Because, like I said earlier today, I've seen some of the worst journalism of my life over the last 2 years, but I've also seen some of the best. I've seen Palestinians reporting under conditions that are so severe and for which the punishment is so total that if they were doing this anywhere else on the planet, and if in the eyes of the journalistic institutions where I live, they were considered sufficiently human, they would be winning every journalism award in existence. And instead, I'm watching them executed. I'm watching them executed for doing the kind of work that in every journalism school where I live, if you took out the word Palestinian and just showed the journalism that's being done, would be what every one of those students aspires to. And this has caused me and a lot of people that I've talked to over the course of this year, and I've talked to a lot, I've been on tour for most of this year, to question what journalistic authority is. You know, there used to be a time, and I have to admit this, where if it was printed in the New York Times, probably it was true. Look at the authority of this. This is the newspaper of record for the Western world. And when I go talk to students, when I go to talk to college students, journalism students or otherwise, the level of faith in the largest scale media institutions where I live has plummeted, has absolutely plummeted, because you are reading one version of events in what is supposed to be the newspaper of record or the sort of respectable media outlet, and then you are opening up your computer and you are watching a child split in half by the force of a bomb that you know your taxpayer money is paid for. How do you coincide these things? How do you deal with them? And so it's caused generational damage to the idea of journalistic authority, and this is going to go far beyond issues related to Palestine or issues related to any one subject. This is going to damage journalism, at least where I live, for generations to come.
زاهرة حرب، ما الذي ينقص الصحافة اليوم؟ وبالمناسبة
Zahira Harb, what is missing when we talk about journalism? We're not talking about Western media, we're talking about Arab media. We're concerning the covering in media in Palestine and elsewhere. What is missing? Is it courage? Is it independence? Ethical clarity? What is it that's missing? Yes, ethical clarity is basic. It's and here I don't want to be very general, but there is this issue with ethical clarity, issue with how to define who deserves. We need to be professional in the coverage and where it's not really feasible and worth it. And what I'm saying here, it's not only about the genocide in Gaza, it's also what we see in Sudan. Again, I say, like, from where I come from, Sudan is just news, piece of news, and 3 to 4 news. Maybe there'll be just a passing piece of news just for seconds, even when they cover about Yemen. Even this is a political decision, even in the Arab world, it's not a professional decision. That's why we need to think of while thinking, while working, we need to take into consideration that there are politics. There's politics that's governing everything, and this is based on that we, as journalists, we don't want to miss the compass and that directs our work. But as Omar said, this is also this failure, this journalist media failure to cover the genocide in Gaza has led also to the leading to this mistrust in journalism. It shook the trust, and this trust will continue. Mistrust will continue for years. It won't end now. This mistrust was brutally injured, even for the generations to come. And those who are studying media are entering into it with, but they're also facing this mistrust issue with the people they work with. Let me go back to this question. How can a journalist carry this duty of documenting what's happening, really happening in the world while they're being shut down or being, because some institutions and agencies have imposed this on them that they should not revert to social media platforms and so on. So how can they do this balance? Under this reality, there are many things. As we say, there's this alternative media. There are many platforms, media platforms, and the press platforms that are the portal to broadcast investigations, reports, and facts that are happening. We're talking here about the covering of Gaza and also covering similar events, and these platforms along with social media, because we face issues with the social media networks. But one of the things that have been met on social media is that they've opened the floor to expression, to post facts that would not be published in conventional media platforms. So even if I'm not able to publish, to commit, even if there are facts and there's information, and I know that there's someone else who can do it, and I can pass it to him, to her, and protect myself. This is just one example, just like the BBC reporters, they've come up with the um, pledge regarding the coverage of Gaza. And they stood up and said, we object how the news in Gaza is being covered. Now, this did not lead to a big change, but it did instigate some changes, not a general change, but like there was. So as if you're saying there are always means to change if we really look deeply. Can you tell us, Omar, in your book you said you told us that some had accused you of defending terrorists. How did you respond to them?
I mean, so a long time ago, I filed a Freedom of Information request, and I got these documents from the Canadian government about this big series of terrorism arrests. And I wrote this story about it, and I was quite proud of the story. It was an exclusive. Nobody else had this information. It was a front page thing. And this was during the era of the internet comments. You know, we were just starting to open up internet comments on the website for the story. And the very first comment was something like, "I don't trust any story on terrorism written by a guy named Alma." And I was like, all right, you know, it's a reminder. It's a reminder of where you stand in the hierarchy. And so I think one of the things I've had to come to terms with is this notion that there's no winning this game, right? If I play by these rules, there's no winning. There is no version of myself that I'm going to become as a person, as a journalist, as anything else that is going to satisfy whoever the hell wrote that comment, right? That doesn't exist. It's not there. And so to go back to something that you were saying earlier, this notion of both trying to start something new, trying to sort of, you know, come up with something from the ground up. I at multiple events I did for this book, people would come up to me afterwards, journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, a couple of other outlets, who were disgusted with how their news organizations were covering Gaza in particular. And a couple of those have tried starting their own organizations, their own grassroots journalism. Do any of these projects have the resources of the New York Times? Absolutely not. And I'm sure that they will probably fail. But unless you're willing to try and start up something, you're working within the same machine that caused you to be disgusted in the first place. And so this to me is the single biggest challenge. There's no version of the story I'm going to write that's going to stop me from being a Muslim guy named Alma. And I know what comes with that. And so one of the things I have tried to do is decide that I'm no longer going to cater to that at all. I'm going to ignore it entirely, and I'm going to try to do journalism that at least allows me to go to bed at night.
زاهرة حرب، أريد أن أعود سريعا إلى موضوع الثقة.
Going back to the trust issue, is journalism still able to convey the truth or to protect the truth, or is the responsibility completely converted to the witnesses? Of course, journalism is still there, is can do it. And if I say no and no, then we should all shut down our agencies and stay at home. But it's not a day will come where this will be the outcome. We should always keep on thinking of digging in models, and there are models, and uh, pushing and opening doors in order to convey the truth and the facts. And we keep on talking about recentering facts. Facts are the base of our work as journalists. And again, I say these facts, for these facts, we need to highlight them if they were connected to an enemy or a friend. It doesn't count. We need to recenter facts. And this is what's most important in our work and our profession. Omar Akkad, this beautiful book, exceptional book that everybody will see it one day. It's a literature, by the way, and I really recommend you all to get to read it. It is a narrative. It's a biography. Is it you were narrating about your personal experience about the journalist Omar Akkad, the child, and your child who is mentioned in this book?
Thank you very much for that. That was far more generous than I deserve. Look, I can't tell you that it's a good book, and I can't tell you that it's worth any of your time. And I think there's much, much better books that have been written on this subject matter. And certainly there's much better books that are going to be written on this subject matter. This just happens to be, again, in the part of the world I live in, one of the earliest ones. Because I started writing in the beginning of November 2023, and I was writing very quickly and I was writing very angry, and those are not usually ingredients for a good book. But I was furious. I'm the most furious I've ever been in my life. And this brings me to this notion of yes, it's a sort of journalistic account or journalism adjacent account, but there's also a lot of personal information in there, like you say, my upbringing, my life, my family, and so on and so forth. And one of the reasons that I thought that had to be a component of the book is because it's impossible for me to write a book about becoming disillusioned with whatever the hell it is that the West stands for without acknowledging my own complicity in that. We're sitting here and I'm not answering you in Arabic, right? I'm answering you in English. And it's pretty flawless English because I've been learning it since I was 5. And if I tried to speak Arabic right now, it would be like you were listening to a 5-year-old. Right? I've for the vast majority of my life, I've oriented myself towards the West because, hey, that's where the winners are. And I succeeded. And I've been rewarded for it endlessly, to the point where I could sell a book like this to one of the most important publishers in the United States. And in order for me to write this kind of book, I also have to acknowledge the cowardice that's involved in that, the complicity that's involved in that, the fact that I'm sitting here knowing that it's my tax money paying for these bombs and paying for these bullets. I couldn't set that aside and write a book that didn't interrogate that. And that's why that part, the personal part, comes into the book. Because otherwise, I would be trying to let myself off the hook for something that I am deeply, deeply complicit in, up to the point of it being the reason I am speaking in this language and the reason I sound like this.
زاهرة حرب.
This big division and this fracture, maybe stemming from maybe this sadness in Omar's voice that Gaza has seen between this fracture between the Western world and the Arab world, and many poles in this world. Do you believe that this fracture can lead to somewhere to can institutionalize something? The demonstrations, like the demonstrations that we've seen around the world, the uprisings that have seen around the world, thousands of things we've seen lately. Can this lead to something different that would lead us to a new era? I'd just like to say that courage that Omar now was talking, in that reflected his courage, maybe in a generation two or another three generations. And I don't want to just talk to hear things to or link it to Arabs, Christian Arabs, and or Muslims. Also, there are other ethnicities in Europe, in the Western world, in the US. They've started this. Uh, this courage that is linked to the commitment, to the identity that I'm proud of who I am. And with this mixture of what I am, it's a mixture between the West and the East, and that has started to make this difference. It started to convey. I don't want to say it's a message because I want to say that it's conveying a reality that states that we are still there. We have a voice. We didn't have a voice, a heard voice 2, 3 generations ago. Now it's there. And this voice is getting higher. And there is this new young generation is brought up now in these countries and will have the ability to access this information. Previously, it was very limited. Accessing information was very limited outside the geographical boundaries. Now, these are open sources. They can access information, and there's a difference. Of course, there's a difference. Something is changing, indeed. But even if we don't see the real impact now, but we will see these impacts maybe later on, maybe after years, maybe after 15 years. The generation that is now growing is who will take the lead later on. This is the hope, and this is the aspiration, and they will have the base of information and follow the steps of those who are institutionalizing to this thing now. And I don't want to sound naive, but we will make it to somewhere different, to a different stop. So what's happening, Omar Akkad, what has happened, what is still happening? Do you feel that the Western liberalism has lost its geographical legitimacy?
So one of the things that has happened since this book has come out is that a lot of people in the US especially have taken issue with the fact that a lot of the book is focused, the rage of the book is focused on this idea of centrist liberalism, this sort of middle of the road, kind of liberalism, instead of the administration that is currently in power, which is, in my opinion at least, openly fascist. Why aren't you angrier at the openly fascist administration than you are at this sort of liberalism that maybe has issues but wants what's best for you in the end? And I think my central issue is that there is an unignorable chasm between the performance of liberalism, and again, I'm talking about the part of the world I live in, the performance of liberalism and the reality. So for a year and a half during this genocide, I would turn on the TV and I would watch a press secretary for the Biden administration come up to a podium just like that one and talk about the desire for an everlasting peace and all of this good stuff. As at exactly the same time, the same administration is funding this genocide. And without their support, that would not happen. And I think what is happening in terms of the sort of crisis of liberalism is that more and more people, particularly younger folks, are having a very hard time looking away from this incredible discrepancy between the performance of liberalism and the reality, which when you look at it, is often not that much different than what the openly fascist guy is at least telling you to your face. And so I think that's the crisis. The crisis is that there's this performance and there's a reality and there's a huge gap between them. It's becoming harder to not see that gap.
زاهرة حرب في أسئلة كثيرة والوقت
Zahira Harb, many questions, and I know we're running out of time, but there's in the past 2 years, even before the last 2 years, when during the Ukraine-Russian war, a lot was said about the duplicity of regulations. What do you see? Do you see in the Western media any real attempt to encounter this duplicity? Yes, there are many attempts. Yeah, there are attempts. Now, are they real? No, they're not real. And we see that this is happening when you confront them about this duplicity logic, and they cannot express and they cannot even justify. This is different than that. Well, tell me, why is this is different? I even wrote an article about why when I come from Lebanon, and in this country, Lebanon is an independent state. It has its borders, and it is still occupied. So when I used to cover for an institution in Britain, I was banned to use the term occupation. I say the Israeli army. I was banned to say, prohibited to say the resistance. I would say military acts under the coverage of impartiality, and because this impartiality is very important, so I need to very well know the language I use. So when you tell them, well, in Ukraine, you are using occupation and you are using war crimes and resistance, such terms, and you're on air, you are sharing in a number of resistance in how they prepare a Molotov missile on air, and this would never happen elsewhere. And then they will tell you this proximity is very much related to the culture, to the geography, because these are related to us, they are close to us. No, this is not geographical proximity, this is political proximity. And because the enemy that is that they're facing is a common on enemies, that's why political proximity allows that journalist to cover wherever he wishes. That is not allowed when he's covering events in Gaza or elsewhere. Omar Akkad, I believe many of the young journalists here in this room with us, what would you tell them? Maybe they feel this despair and the fatigue, the exhaustion that they are witnessing, the genocide, but they can do nothing. What do you want?
Look, I'm in no position to give anybody advice on anything or to offer of expertise to the young journalists in this room, all of whom I'm sure are engaged in far better journalism than I ever did when I was doing this for a living. I will simply say that things are changing. And you talk about this idea of incremental change, and it's infuriating. It's infuriating how slow, how glacial it is. And I don't want to discount that. I don't want to downplay that. In the summer of last year, I was asked by the opinions editor at my former newspaper to write an op-ed. And I said, look, I'm going to save you some time. You're not going to run this because I'm going to call it a genocide and I'm going to say that Western governments are complicit. And the editor, who's a friend of mine, said, yeah, you're right. And then in January of this year, same editor, same newspaper, asked me to write an op-ed. And I said, listen, I'm going to save you some time. You're not going to run this because I'm going to call it a genocide and I'm going to say that Western governments are complicit. And he said, go ahead. What has changed? Have enough bodies piled up? I don't know. But something is changing. And I think a huge part of it is because as much as I think institutionally journalism has failed, I think journalists have done an outstanding job. So many journalists, especially young journalists, especially ones who haven't been sort of co-opted into the idea that you put your career first at all costs. And if that means having to shut up about this one thing, just go for it and you'll be fine. And so instead of offering any advice to make you less depressed, I will say, yeah, you should be depressed. The world's on fire. Horrible things are happening. The worst human beings on earth are in charge of our institutions. But also know that the work that you are doing is vital to change any of this. And for that, you have my eternal gratitude.
عمر العقاد شكرا جزيلا. زاهرة حرب.
Thank you very much, Omar Akkad. Thank you, Zahira Harb. Oh, many questions. I think we have 5 minutes only for this session to end. Bisan Zarzar, I'm a journalist in a Dutch newspaper, Hatrao. I have more than one question. I'd say in the past 2 years, I'm a Syrian Palestinian person. When I started my work there, I noted that there's this big change that is taking place and rapidly. At the beginning of my work, they were against using these terms. Now, what I wanted to point to is that even in a short margin, there's a lot that's talked about advocacy in journalism, which advocates our cases. I believe in the Arab world, we work based on this, and I personally started as a journalist against the Assad regime. So that's what I've learned throughout my professional life, either with or against. But what I want to say also, and I want to note here that to work, and I witnessed this personally, that there's a change, the logic in journalism. And I want to say that maybe in the Arab world, we used to look up to them like they're the best, that they have it. But now I discover with time that we are the real journalists. 2 years ago, I said something. I said that it was in an ARIJ conference. I said there's a time. Now it's the time that Western journalism should learn from us. Learn how do we act in such crisis. We're not talking about covering news in normal times. We are living in a crisis times, and especially when we talk about the Syrian case, about the Palestinian case, there is courage when covering. Many journalists perform that we have never witnessed in Western media, and I do agree with you regarding journalism advocacy. It's not a taboo. When we teach this, we teach types of journalism. So the journalist need to know he must know what he's doing and or what she's doing. If I know that my role is advocacy journalism, I need to know that I need to be transparent. And if I'm doing something related to education, something, whatever, we need to learn. We need to acknowledge the role that we are performing. Every journalist need to acknowledge and recognize the context they're covering. And we cannot really divide these, separate them from each other. One last question. Thank you very much, Omar. I'm speaking Arabic. I do agree with you. I totally agree with you regarding what's happening in perspectives of the US and Canada about the role of journalism. And I really like what you mentioned about the language and lexicon. And I've been living in the US for 20 years. And I know that when the changes that happen and we approach the public in a certain discourse, we need them to ask from the agencies to be more impartial and neutral. So I believe that part of what we've learned from the Gaza case and from the Western world and living there is that our journalism needs to move elsewhere. Like we need to have discussions from to stem from the societies.
I'm going to skip a response because I feel like the question needs to come out of here. But for whatever it's worth, I agree completely. I agree completely with everything you said. But please.
Okay, so for that, I'm going to ask it in English, Omar. It's important for me that you also understand.
Have I just been answering all the questions wrong because I completely misunderstood what was being said in Arabic? I apologize.
When we're talking about journalism, I think we have to stop talking about 2 points of view because there is a colonized and there is a colonizer. And only if we insist that there is only one point of view regarding particular things in history, then no one will understand that not for each story there's 2 points of views. This is number one. Number two, I think journalists, it's important that I don't want people to be pro-Palestine, but I want them to stick to their morals to their ethics. So if they're with freedom, automatically they're going to be with Palestine. Freedom, self-determination, liberty. If they are with apartheid, settler colonial, genocide, ethnic cleansing, so automatically they're going to be with the other side. And for this, I tell them, don't be Palestinian, don't be pro-Palestine. But if you really stick to your ethics, then you will be with us. And this is where they need to understand very clear, and we don't even need to explain it. Thank you.
شكرا لأنه لخصت الجلسة. Thank you. Actually, she summarized it all. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we're back. Can we take one more question? No, they say no. Done. 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 Sorry. Sorry. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Zahira.